Some stories begin with a gunshot, others with a storm, but the one people still whisper about across the desert began with something far quieter, a lone cowboy seeing a girl where no one should have been standing. The sun hung low over the Arizona desert that evening, turning the sand the color of old copper and stretching the shadows of the cactus long across the empty land. Ethan Caldwell rode slowly through that fading light, his horse stepping carefully over dry stone and brittle sage. Out there, nearly 50 miles from the nearest town and farther still from any ranch worth mentioning, a man usually rode alone with his thoughts and the sound of wind moving across the earth. Ethan had grown used to that silence. For years it had been his only company. He had a small spread north of the Salt River, a weathered cabin, a few head of cattle, and more open sky than any man truly needed. Most days passed with nothing more remarkable than a drifting cloud or a wandering coyote. That was how Ethan liked it. The desert had a way of keeping secrets, and he had a few he preferred to leave buried beneath its dust. The wind shifted as he guided his horse along a narrow ridge of pale stone, and something in the distance caught his eye. At first he thought it was a mirage, the kind that sometimes shimmered above the desert floor when the heat refused to leave even after sundown. But this shape didn't fade when he blinked. It stood still against the horizon, small but unmistakably human. Ethan slowed his horse, narrowing his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. No wagon tracks cut across the sand. No campfire smoke curled into the sky. No horse waited nearby. Yet there she was. A young woman stood alone nearly 100 yards ahead, her long dark hair stirring gently in the evening wind, her silhouette steady against the fading sun. Her clothing marked her clearly as Apache, stitched leather and woven patterns that carried the quiet dignity of a people who understood the desert better than any map ever could. Ethan felt his horse shift uneasily beneath him as he drew closer. Out here, nothing happened by accident. A lone traveler in the desert might be lost, desperate, or running from something. But the girl did not look lost. She did not move as he approached. She simply waited. When Ethan guided his horse to within 20 yards, the desert fell so silent that even the faint creak of his saddle seemed too loud for the moment. The girl lifted her eyes to meet his, calm and steady, the kind of gaze that made a man feel as though he had stepped into a story already halfway written. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear in the still evening air. "Turn back," she said. Ethan frowned slightly, glancing past her toward the empty horizon stretching miles beyond. "That's so?" he replied, his voice calm but cautious. The girl's expression did not change. The wind lifted a small swirl of dust between them, and when it settled, she spoke again. "Turn back," she repeated softly, "or you won't make it through this desert tonight." Ethan followed her gaze toward the western sky. At first he saw nothing. Then, far in the distance, a faint cloud of dust rose slowly against the dying light. Riders, and they were coming fast. The dust on the horizon moved like a slow rolling tide across the desert floor, faint at first, almost easy to mistake for the evening wind lifting loose sand across the flats. But Ethan Caldwell had spent too many years riding open land to mistake the rhythm of horses moving fast. He watched the distant cloud carefully, his hand resting lightly on the saddle horn while his horse shifted beneath him, ears turning toward the same direction. Riders did not usually travel that hard across empty country unless something important waited at the end of the trail. Ethan looked back at the young Apache woman standing quietly a few yards away. She had not moved since he first noticed the dust, and the calm on her face did not match the urgency of the warning she had given him. Most people facing a group of riders in the desert would show fear or hurry to leave. She simply watched the horizon as if the approaching men were part of a story she already knew the ending to. Ethan studied her more closely now. The fading sunlight caught the patterns on her clothing, stitched with careful detail that told of tradition and patience. Around her neck hung a small turquoise pendant tied with worn leather cord, the stone catching the last orange glow of the sun. There was nothing careless about the way she carried herself. Even standing alone in the open desert, she held the quiet balance of someone who belonged to this land. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice steady but thoughtful. "Those riders looking for you?" The girl did not answer immediately. She followed the drifting dust with her eyes, measuring distance the way desert travelers often did. not with maps or mile markers, but with the way sunlight faded across the hills. After a long moment, she nodded once. "They are coming for me," she said calmly. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Friends." The corner of her mouth lifted just enough to show that she understood the question. "Not today." Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, glancing again at the horizon. The dust cloud had grown thicker now. He counted shapes forming inside it. One rider, then another, then more. At least a dozen horses by his guess. Maybe more riding behind the ridge where the desert dipped low before rising again. That many riders covering open ground meant they would reach this place in less than 20 minutes. His horse shifted again, sensing the tension building in the quiet air. Ethan ran a hand along the animal's neck to calm it while he considered the situation. Out here a man usually avoided other people's trouble. That rule had kept him alive longer than most men expected. Yet something about the stillness of the young woman standing beside the trail made the decision less simple than it should have been. She had warned him instead of hiding. She had given him the chance to turn around and leave before the riders ever appeared. Ethan looked back at her. "You planning to stand here and wait for them?" The girl finally turned her full attention to him. Her dark eyes were steady, thoughtful, almost curious. "I was waiting for someone," she said quietly. Ethan raised an eyebrow beneath the brim of his hat. "And you found him?" For the first time since he arrived, the faintest trace of a smile appeared in her expression. "Maybe." The wind shifted again, carrying the distant sound of hooves across the desert floor. The riders were closer now, the low thunder of horses traveling through hard sand growing clearer with each passing second. Ethan studied the horizon one last time, before looking back at the girl. "Well," he said slowly, tightening the reins in his hand. "Looks like we are both about to find out." The sound of hooves carried across the desert like distant thunder rolling over dry earth, growing clearer with every passing second, and Ethan Caldwell knew the riders would reach them soon. The sun had slipped lower now, hovering just above the jagged line of distant mesas, painting the sand with long shadows that stretched across the open land like quiet warnings. Ethan shifted slightly in the saddle and studied the dust cloud again. What had looked like a distant blur only minutes ago now revealed the shapes of men and horses moving fast across the flats. He counted carefully. One rider broke ahead of the others, then another followed, and soon the outline of several more appeared behind them. 15 riders at least, maybe closer to 20 if the rest were hidden behind the ridge. That many men traveling together did not ride for conversation. Ethan glanced toward the Apache woman beside the trail. She still had not moved. Her posture remained calm, almost patient, as though she had expected this moment from the very beginning. The wind brushed through her dark hair again, and the small turquoise pendant at her throat shifted softly against the leather cord. Ethan frowned slightly, studying her expression. Most people faced with a group of riders closing in this quickly would show fear or urgency. But the girl simply watched the horizon, her eyes steady and thoughtful, like someone waiting for a signal only she could understand. Ethan cleared his throat and spoke again, his voice low but firm. "If those riders mean trouble, standing here is not going to help either of us." The girl turned her head slightly, looking up at him with the same calm gaze she had held since the moment he arrived. "You should still leave," she said quietly. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. "You already told me that. And you did not listen." Ethan glanced once more toward the horizon. The riders were much closer now. He could hear the rhythm of hooves striking hard ground, and the faint clink of tack moving with the horses. The desert carried sound in strange ways, and tonight it carried the message clearly. These men were riding fast and straight toward this exact spot. Ethan rested both hands on the saddle horn for a moment, thinking carefully. A man who spent long years in open country learned when to walk away from someone else's problem. Trouble had a way of spreading if a person stood too close to it. Yet something about the young woman's quiet confidence kept him from turning his horse around and disappearing into the fading light. She had warned him. She had given him every chance to leave. That meant something. Ethan finally looked down at her again. "You still have not told me your name." For a brief moment the girl seemed surprised by the question. Then she answered, "Nayeli." Ethan nodded once, committing the name to memory. Ethan Caldwell. Nayeli studied him carefully after hearing his name, as though measuring something deeper than the simple sound of the words. The wind shifted again, carrying the riders even closer now. Ethan turned his head and saw the first of them crest the low ridge less than half a mile away. The late sunlight flashed against the edges of their saddles as the horses pushed forward through drifting sand. Ethan tightened his grip on the reins and looked back at Nayeli. "Looks like your company just arrived." Nayeli followed his gaze, watching the riders approach with the same steady calm she had shown all along. Then she said something that made Ethan pause. "They are not my company." Ethan raised an eyebrow beneath his hat. "No." Nayeli shook her head slowly, her eyes still fixed on the distant riders. "They are my father's warriors." Ethan blinked once, surprised by the answer. "Your father must be a powerful man to send that many riders after one girl." Nayeli finally turned toward him again, and the faint smile returned to her face. "He did not send them after me," she said softly. "He sent them to see what kind of man you are." The words lingered in the quiet desert air longer than Ethan Caldwell expected. He looked at Nayeli again, trying to decide if she was joking, but nothing in her calm expression suggested humor. The riders continued to approach across the open land, their horses moving quickly now, the rising dust trailing behind them like a long pale ribbon stretching across the desert floor. Ethan glanced back toward them and then returned his gaze to the young woman, standing beside the trail. "Your father's warriors," he repeated slowly. "And they came all this way to study a man they have never met." Nayeli nodded once, as if the answer were obvious. "My father believes a man shows his true nature when he thinks no one is watching." Ethan let out a quiet breath and shifted slightly in the saddle. The explanation did not make the situation any simpler. If anything, it made it stranger. He looked again at the riders who had now crossed the ridge and were spreading slightly as they rode forward, their silhouettes dark against the fading sunlight. The desert wind carried the sound of their horses more clearly now, steady and controlled rather than reckless. These men rode with discipline. Ethan had seen that kind of movement before. Men who traveled together like that were used to following a leader and trusted each other enough to move as one. He looked back at Nayeli. "Your father sends 20 men across the desert just to watch a stranger?" Nayeli tilted her head slightly, considering his words before answering. "Not a stranger," she said quietly. "A man who chose not to leave." Ethan raised an eyebrow beneath the brim of his hat. "You warned me to turn back." "Yes. And now I am being tested for staying." Nayeli's faint smile returned. "The desert often tests those who pass through it." Ethan leaned back slightly in the saddle, resting one hand on the worn leather of the saddle horn while the other held the reins loosely. The sky above them had begun to shift from gold to deep amber as the sun sank lower behind the mesas, and the long shadows across the sand made the approaching riders appear even larger than they were. He studied them again carefully. The first rider had slowed his horse slightly now, allowing the others to close the distance behind him. Their movement had changed. They were no longer rushing forward. They were approaching with control, almost with ceremony. Ethan glanced down at Nayeli. "You seem very sure they will not cause trouble." Nayeli watched the riders for a moment before answering. "They will not cause trouble if you do not create it." Ethan considered that quietly. He had learned long ago that most dangerous situations in the frontier began with misunderstandings. The desert did not care about pride or fear. It only cared whether a man understood when to remain calm. The riders were now less than 200 yards away. Ethan could see their clothing clearly, the patterns of woven fabric and leather that marked them as Apache warriors. Several carried long spears upright as they rode, not raised in threat, but held with quiet dignity. The lead rider slowed his horse further until the entire group gradually came to a stop about 50 yards from where Ethan and Nayeli stood. The sudden stillness returned to the desert, broken only by the soft breathing of horses and the whisper of wind across the sand. Ethan studied the men carefully. None of them reached for a weapon. None of them spoke. They simply watched. Ethan turned to Nayeli again. "So this is the test." Nayeli nodded slowly. "Yes." Ethan glanced once more at the silent line of warriors before returning his attention to her. "And what exactly are they waiting to see?" Nayeli looked up at him, her eyes steady and thoughtful. "They are waiting to see," she said softly, "what kind of man remains calm when 20 warriors arrive and the desert goes silent." The desert remained silent after the riders stopped, the kind of silence that made every small movement feel louder than it should have been. Ethan Caldwell sat still in the saddle, his horse breathing slowly beneath him while the warm evening wind moved across the open land. 20 Apache warriors waited in a wide line across the sand, their horses calm, their eyes steady, their presence filling the empty desert without a single word spoken. Ethan had lived long enough on the frontier to understand that some moments required patience more than action. He rested one hand lightly on the saddle horn and let the quiet stretch between them. No one reached for a weapon. No one rushed forward. The warriors simply watched him the way experienced riders often studied a distant storm, careful, thoughtful, and unhurried. Ethan turned his head slightly toward Nayeli, who still stood beside the trail with the same calm posture she had held since the moment he first saw her. The fading sunlight touched the turquoise pendant at her throat again, the stone glowing softly, as if it carried a small piece of the desert sky within it. Ethan spoke quietly without taking his eyes off the riders. "Your father must believe patience reveals more than questions." Nayeli nodded once. A man who explains himself too quickly may be hiding something. Ethan considered that for a moment, and then allowed a faint smile to touch the corner of his mouth. "Then they might be disappointed. I do not have much to hide." The lead warrior shifted his horse forward slightly, closing the distance by a few yards. The movement was slow and controlled, more like a respectful approach than a challenge. Ethan noticed the rider carried himself with quiet authority. The man's hair was streaked with gray and braided neatly behind his shoulders, and the calm way the other warriors remained behind him suggested he was someone they respected deeply. The rider studied Ethan for a long moment before finally speaking in a steady voice that carried clearly through the still air. "You did not leave when you were warned." Ethan met the man's gaze without tension. "No." The warrior nodded once, as if acknowledging a simple truth rather than judging it. Most men would have turned their horse and ridden away. Ethan glanced briefly toward Nayeli before answering. Most men were not asked to stay. The warrior's eyes moved to Nayeli and then back to Ethan again. The desert wind brushed through the group once more, stirring dust across the ground between them. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then the older warrior dismounted slowly from his horse and stepped forward. The other riders remained where they were, still silent, still watching. Ethan slid one boot free from the stirrup and stepped down from his saddle as well. The moment felt natural, almost expected, as though both men understood that standing face to face on the ground was the proper way to continue whatever test had begun. The older warrior stopped several feet away and studied Ethan carefully, not with suspicion, but with the thoughtful attention of someone measuring character rather than strength. Finally he spoke again. "My daughter told you to leave." Ethan nodded once. "She did." The warrior's eyes shifted briefly toward Nayeli, who stood quietly beside them. Then he returned his gaze to Ethan. "But you stayed." Ethan looked out across the desert for a moment before answering, the last light of the setting sun stretching across the horizon. Sometimes the desert puts a person exactly where he is meant to be. The warrior studied him for another long moment. Then, slowly, the older man's expression softened just enough to reveal approval. He turned slightly and spoke to the other riders in a calm voice Ethan could not fully understand. The warriors listened, and then something unexpected happened. One by one, the riders lowered their heads respectfully toward Ethan Caldwell. The desert held its breath as the line of warriors lowered their heads, and for a moment Ethan Caldwell wondered if he had misunderstood what he was seeing. The evening wind moved gently across the sand, brushing against the leather of saddles and the woven cloth of the riders' clothing, yet none of them spoke. The gesture had been quiet, almost subtle, but its meaning was unmistakable. Respect. Ethan stood still beside his horse, his hat casting a long shadow across his face as he studied the men before him. He had expected suspicion or challenge, perhaps even a tense exchange of words that might take hours to settle beneath the desert sky. What he had not expected was silence followed by a sign of honor. The older warrior who had stepped forward watched Ethan carefully, his expression calm and thoughtful, as though measuring the cowboy's reaction just as closely as he had measured his earlier choices. After several seconds the man finally spoke again, his voice steady and deliberate. A man who remains calm when he is surrounded by strangers shows that fear does not guide his steps. Ethan glanced briefly toward Nayeli, who still stood quietly near the trail, her eyes reflecting the last amber glow of the setting sun. Then he returned his gaze to the warrior before him. I have spent enough years in this desert to know that panic rarely helps a man find his way home. The older warrior nodded slowly, as though the answer confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. Behind him the line of riders remained motionless, their horses shifting only slightly as the cool air of evening began to settle across the valley. Ethan noticed the way the warriors carried themselves with discipline and patience, not restless or aggressive, but steady like men who understood both the strength and the responsibility that came with it. The older warrior placed one hand lightly over his chest in a respectful gesture before speaking again. "My name is Tahoma." Ethan nodded once in return. Ethan Caldwell. Tahoma studied him carefully after hearing the name, as though searching his memory for something familiar in the sound of it. Then his eyes shifted briefly toward Nayeli, and something like quiet pride appeared in his expression. "You met my daughter today," Tahoma said. Ethan glanced again at Nayeli. "That seems to be the case." Tahoma allowed the faintest smile to appear. "She has always trusted the desert to guide her toward the right people." Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering the words. And today the desert guided her to a cattle rancher who was simply riding home. Tahoma shook his head gently. No man simply arrives where the wind and sand decide to bring him. The older warrior then turned slightly and spoke a few words to the riders behind him in his own language. The warriors listened carefully, and then several of them dismounted from their horses in quiet unison. They did not move toward Ethan in a threatening way. Instead, they stepped aside, creating an open path through their line that stretched toward the distant hills where the evening shadows were beginning to gather. Ethan watched the unexpected movement with curiosity. Tahoma gestured toward the open path across the sand. "A man who shows respect deserves to be welcomed as a guest." Ethan followed the direction of the warrior's hand, then looked back at him. "You are inviting me somewhere." Tahoma nodded once. "Our camp lies 10 miles beyond those hills." The older man's voice softened slightly as he continued. "And tonight my people would like to know the man who chose to stand beside my daughter when the desert offered him an easier road." The last light of the sun disappeared behind the western mesas as Ethan Caldwell rode beside the Apache warriors, the desert slowly changing from warm gold to deep shades of blue and violet. The air grew cooler with every mile, and the wide open land seemed to stretch even farther beneath the quiet sky. Ethan followed the path through the hills exactly as Tahoma had indicated, his horse moving steadily while Nayeli rode just ahead of him beside her father. The line of warriors traveled with a calm rhythm, their horses stepping across the rocky ground with the ease of riders who knew every ridge and valley of this desert. No one hurried. No one spoke loudly. It felt less like a group, escorting a stranger, and more like a family returning home after a long day beneath the sun. Ethan had spent most of his life riding through the frontier, yet something about this journey felt different from any trail he had followed before. The silence carried a sense of quiet respect rather than tension, and the warriors seemed comfortable allowing him to ride among them without constant watch. After several miles the land began to change, the wide sand flats giving way to narrow stone paths winding between tall red cliffs. The desert wind moved softly through the canyon walls, creating a low whisper that echoed across the rocks. Ethan noticed faint trails of smoke rising beyond the hills ahead, thin gray lines drifting into the evening sky. Tahoma slowed his horse slightly and glanced back toward Ethan. "Our camp is just beyond this ridge," he said calmly. Ethan nodded, studying the canyon entrance before them. The narrow passage opened into a wide valley hidden between towering cliffs, a place that would be nearly impossible to find without someone who knew the land guiding the way. As they reached the top of the ridge, the view beyond caused Ethan to slow his horse in quiet surprise. Spread across the valley floor below were dozens of small fires glowing gently in the darkness, each one surrounded by families moving calmly through the evening air. Tents made from leather and woven cloth formed neat rows along the valley, and the distant sound of voices and laughter drifted upward through the cool night breeze. It was not a war camp. It was a home. Nayeli turned slightly in her saddle and looked back at Ethan with a faint smile. "You look surprised," she said softly. Ethan let out a quiet breath as he studied the valley below. "I expected something smaller." Nayeli followed his gaze toward the fires. "My father leads many families." Tahoma spoke again as he guided his horse down the path toward the camp. Our people have lived in this valley for many generations. As the riders entered the valley, several figures near the fires turned to watch them approach. Children paused in their games, and elders looked up from their conversations. Yet there was no fear in their faces when they saw Ethan riding beside the warriors. Instead, there was curiosity, the quiet interest of people seeing someone new arrive. Among them, the riders slowed their horses near the center of the camp, where the largest fire burned steadily against the darkening sky. Tahoma dismounted first and turned to Ethan with a calm expression. "Tonight you are our guest," he said. Ethan stepped down from his saddle and looked around the camp once more, the warm glow of firelight reflecting in the eyes of the people watching nearby. Nayeli approached him quietly and stood beside him beneath the wide desert sky. Then she spoke in a softer voice meant only for him. The test was not only for the warriors. Ethan glanced toward her. "No." Nayeli shook her head gently. "My father wanted to see whether the desert had chosen the right man to walk into our story." The evening settled gently over the valley as the first stars appeared above the tall desert cliffs, their pale light mixing with the warm glow of the many fires that burned quietly across the camp. Ethan Caldwell stood beside Nayeli near the largest fire while people moved calmly around them, preparing food, sharing stories, and finishing the small tasks that ended a long day beneath the desert sun. The air smelled of cedar smoke and warm bread, and somewhere nearby a soft drum began to beat slowly, steady as a heartbeat carried through the night air. Ethan watched the life of the camp with quiet attention. Children ran between the fires laughing softly, while elders sat together, speaking in low voices. The valley felt peaceful, protected by the tall red cliffs that surrounded it like ancient walls built by the desert itself. For a man who had spent most evenings alone beside a small ranch house, the sight of so many families gathered together felt almost unfamiliar. Nayeli noticed the thoughtful expression on his face and followed his gaze across the camp. "You are wondering why my father brought you here," she said gently. Ethan nodded once. "A little." Nayeli looked toward the fire where Tahoma now sat speaking quietly with several of the older men of the tribe. "My father believes a man is understood best when he is seen among people rather than alone on the trail." Ethan folded his arms loosely across his chest while watching the camp continue its evening rhythm. "And what does he hope to learn about me tonight?" Nayeli considered the question for a moment before answering. "Whether you walk through the world with respect or with fear." Ethan allowed a faint smile to appear. "I suppose there are worse tests a man could face." Nayeli smiled slightly in return, then reached to remove the small turquoise pendant from around her neck. The stone glowed softly in the firelight as she held it in her hand. Ethan looked at the pendant with curiosity. "That stone seems important." Nayeli nodded. "It belonged to my grandmother." She held it out toward him. "In our tradition, a gift like this is given only to someone who has proven his heart is steady." Ethan looked at the pendant but did not reach for it immediately. "Your father may have a different opinion about that." Nayeli glanced toward Tahoma and then back at Ethan again. "My father already knows the answer he came to find." Before Ethan could respond, Tahoma stood from the fire and walked slowly toward them. The older chief looked from his daughter to Ethan and then to the pendant resting in Nayeli's hand. For a moment the three of them stood quietly beneath the wide desert sky, while the camp continued its gentle life around them. Then Tahoma spoke in a calm voice. "A man who enters a stranger's land with respect honors both himself and the people he meets." Ethan inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. Tahoma nodded toward the pendant in Nayeli's hand. "That gift is not given lightly." Ethan finally reached forward and accepted the small turquoise stone. It felt cool and smooth in his palm, as though it carried the quiet strength of the desert itself. Tahoma watched him carefully before continuing. "Tonight you arrived here as a stranger." The older chief looked toward the fires of the valley where his people gathered beneath the stars. Then he returned his gaze to Ethan Caldwell. "But when the sun rises tomorrow, you will leave this valley as a friend of our people." The night passed quietly in the valley, and by the time the first light of morning began to spread across the desert sky, Ethan Caldwell had already been awake for some time. The air carried the cool freshness that came only during the early hours before the desert sun returned to claim the land again. Around him the Apache camp slowly began to stir as families rose to greet the new day. Small fires were rekindled, Horses shifted gently along their tether lines, and the soft murmur of voices drifted across the valley floor. Ethan stood near the edge of the camp where the valley opened toward the eastern hills, the turquoise pendant resting in his palm as he watched the sunrise paint the cliffs with pale gold light. He had spent many mornings alone on his ranch watching the desert wake up, yet this morning felt different. The valley behind him was alive with quiet purpose, and for the first time in many years Ethan realized that the desert did not always have to be a place of solitude. Footsteps approached softly behind him. He did not need to turn to know who it was. Nayeli stopped beside him and looked out across the rising sun as well, her expression calm and thoughtful. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt natural, like the desert itself understood that some moments did not require words. Finally, Nayeli glanced at the pendant still resting in his hand. "You are leaving today?" she said gently. Ethan nodded once. "My cattle will start wondering where I disappeared to if I stay too long." Nayeli smiled faintly at that. The desert has a way of guiding people back when the time is right. Ethan turned the turquoise stone slowly between his fingers, studying the way the morning light moved across its surface. "Your father was generous to offer this." Nayeli shook her head softly. "It was not generosity. It was recognition." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "Recognition of what?" Nayeli looked toward the valley where the people of her tribe were beginning their day. Children were laughing again. Elders were speaking beside the fires, and riders were preparing their horses for the long trails that waited beyond the hills. Then she turned back to Ethan. "Recognition that some people arrive in our lives for a reason greater than chance." Ethan considered that quietly. The desert wind moved gently through the valley once more, carrying the scent of warm cedar smoke and dry sage across the open land. After a moment, Tahoma approached them as well, his presence calm and steady like the desert cliffs that had watched over his people for generations. The older chief looked from Ethan to his daughter and then toward the rising sun beyond the hills. "The desert changes many things," Tahoma said slowly. Ethan nodded once in agreement. "It does." Tahoma placed a firm but respectful hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Yesterday you arrived here as a traveler crossing unknown land." He then gestured toward the valley and the people who now move through the morning light. "Today you leave knowing you have friends beneath these cliffs." Ethan looked across the valley one final time before placing the turquoise pendant carefully around his neck. He mounted his horse and turned toward the trail that wound out of the valley toward the wide desert beyond. Nayeli and Tahoma watched quietly as he guided the horse forward. When Ethan reached the top of the ridge, he paused for a moment and looked back. The valley glowed softly beneath the rising sun, the campfires fading as daylight spread across the sand. Nayeli stood beside her father near the center of the camp, her figure small against the vast desert landscape. Ethan tipped his hat in silent respect before turning his horse toward the open horizon. Years later, travelers passing through that part of the desert would sometimes hear a quiet story shared beside campfires at night. It was the story of a lone cowboy who once rode into the hidden valley of an Apache chief and left not as a stranger, but as a man the desert itself had chosen to remember.